Good evening, and welcome to the Stanley Knowles Humanitarian Service Lecture for 2009. My name is Graham Brown. I'm principal of St. Paul's University College at the University of Waterloo and home of the Stanley Knowles Lecture. Tonight we are most pleased to partner with the Center for International Governance Innovation and the Balsillie School of International Affairs to provide this wonderful community with an opportunity to engage with the compelling arguments of economist Dr. Dambisa Moyo. As an economist, Dr. Moyo, based on her book, which I've read, and you'll get a chance to purchase after the lecture, she's the exception to the rule that if you ask 5 economists for their views, you'll get 10 opinions. Ms. Moyo's views on aid to Africa are trenchant, focused, and uncompromising. She will be introduced in a minute more fully by Dr. Larry Swadek, the director of our International Development Program here at the university. But first, I'd like to say a couple of words about the Stanley Knowles lectureship. Stanley Knowles represented Winnipeg North Centre in the House of Commons from 1942 to 1984, with one short rest period from 1958 to 1962. He did so for the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation and later its successor, the New Democratic Party. He was the conscience of Parliament, with unequaled understanding of its procedures and its spirit. At his retirement in 1984, his legacy included major contributions to pensions, public housing, and other benefits for Canada's poor, elderly, and unemployed. In the 90s, friends, colleagues, and admirers of Knowles enthusiastically answered the call to establish a visiting professorship in his name at St. Paul's in association with the Canadian Studies program at the university. When that program closed in 2005, I asked Ron Lang, Knowles' longtime friend and really one of the chief fundraisers for the professorship, how we might continue the public lecture without a link to Canadian studies. And he said, as long as the Knowles name is associated with humanitarianism, the donors and supporters will be pleased. And so the lectureship was reborn as the Stanley Knowles Humanitarian Service Lecture, and we look forward to it becoming an annual highlight in the broad intellectual environment of this great university and this great Waterloo community. Ron Lang could not be with us tonight, but I'm pleased to acknowledge the presence of Bob Kerr, whose generosity made it possible to begin the Stanley Knowles Professorship Program back in 1998 and to continue it. And please join me now in welcoming Bob, who is here with us this evening, and thank him for his support. Bob is also the patron of the Kerr-Saltzman Lecture, which many of you will have heard of in international affairs, and we hope very soon to announce the Kerr-Saltzman Lecturer for 2010. And let me also acknowledge here tonight Professor Bob Needham, now retired, longtime Director of Canadian Studies, and who was instrumental in getting the Stanley Knowles Lectureship and the Kerr-Saltzman up and running. Bob, where are you? Thank you. The sponsors of the Stanley Knowles sought a public lecture that engaged a broad audience of all ages to think about serious injustice in a way that allowed them, as citizens, to take action for a more fair and humane common life together. It would please the sponsors tonight to know that we have students from 2 high schools, one in the area and one not so far away, Bill Bulmer and the students of Kitchener-Waterloo Collegiate and Vocational School. Where are you? There they are, right here. And John Leon, standing in for Malcolm Hamilton for the Notre Dame Catholic Secondary School of Brampton. Are those students here with us tonight? There they are. Should we ask which is the best school, or maybe we might get into trouble there? Okay. I must say I'm very impressed. As you can tell by looking at me, I'm a long way from my high school days, but I think I can recall I didn't give up very many Friday nights for a lecture in those days, so well done. Great to see you. After Dr. Moyo completes her remarks, she will take questions from the audience, so be thinking and prepare your questions. Then John Tennant of CG will thank her, and after that we will close and have in the vestibule behind us here, Dr. Moyo will sign copies of her book. And now let me briefly introduce Dr. Larry Swadek, who is director of our new International Development Honors Degree Program here, jointly delivered by the Faculty of Environment and St. Paul's College. Larry spent the first 20 years of his academic career mostly in sub-Saharan Africa in teaching, research, and development projects. About 18 months ago, we were fortunate that he came home to Canada and to Waterloo to lead the implementation of our new program. On African development issues, he speaks with knowledge and direct experience. It's a pleasure to ask Larry to introduce the 2009 Stanley Knowles Humanitarian Service Lecturer, Dr. Dambisa Moyo. Larry?
Thanks, Graham. Thanks. Good evening, everyone. Nice to see you. Dumela Leboma Lebora. And I have lots of my African students in the audience I'm very excited about this evening. This is a great little book. As you will find out, this book, if you haven't read it already, its time has arrived, and there's a lot of things that lessons we can learn from it. It's controversial because it says certain kinds of aid are dead, and that's sort of like saying that peace is not, I'm against peace. Aid is good, aid is help, we're all for aid. And I want to start off tonight with I'm going to read a few sections from the Toronto Star editorial on 9 November 2009. The heading is Aid Agency a Mess. Canada's $4.7 billion foreign aid program is one of the world's most generous. And note the language used here, one of the most generous. And on Prime Minister Stephen Harper's watch, Ottawa has promised to provide more focused help for 20 priority developing countries in 3 critical areas, boosting food production, promoting economic growth, and improving the lives of young people. That's the good news from Auditor General Sheila Fraser in her annual report last week. The bad news is that the Canadian International Development Agency and its 1,800 mostly Ottawa-based staff aren't close to delivering as hoped. CIDA, the organization that administers 80% of our aid, is a demoralized bureaucratic mess. And this is not news. The agency has had 5 ministers since 2000, 6 different strategic plans since 1995, ever-shifting country priorities and objectives, including Harper's tilt toward the Americas and away from Africa, and an endless churn of top managers. That turmoil has taken its toll. CIDA is not realizing its goal of making a more meaningful Canadian contribution, Fraser reported. Donors, recipient governments, and program staff are unclear about the agency's direction and long-term commitments to specific countries or regions. And this is the critique. And then as you get your way down to the bottom, it says, despite the recession, Harper's government intends to increase aid to $5 billion next year. And a bit later it says, of course, Canada could be more generous in the aggregate. Last year we spent just 3.32% of our economic output on aid. So on the one hand, we give all this money and we have no idea what we're doing with it, and it's a waste. But on the other hand, we're going to give more. What a great idea. And it finishes with, but it's hard to make a case for boosting aid when CIDA's focus and delivery are under a cloud. Somebody needs to clean house. And I think that perhaps Dambisa Moyo might be the person to start to point us to where the brooms may be hidden. Let me just say a few words about Dr. Moyo. Dambisa Moyo was born and raised in Zambia, Southern Africa. She completed a PhD in economics at Oxford University and holds a master's from Harvard. She completed a bachelor's degree in chemistry and an MBA in finance at the American University in Washington, D.C. And as I tell most of my students in the InDev program, multidisciplinary approaches to things is where it's at, and this is clearly a multidisciplinary approach. She worked at Goldman Sachs for 8 years in the debt capital markets, hedge fund coverage, and in global macroeconomic teams. Previously, she worked at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. Dambisa is a member of the boards of London Petroleum and SAB Miller. Oh, that's a company close to my heart. Dambisa is a patron for Absolute Return for Kids, ARC, a hedge fund-supported children's charity. She serves on the boards of the London for Africa Foundation and Room to Read, an educational charity. And, you know, she's written this book about how aid is better for Africa, but she's not a one-hit wonder. She's got more ideas on the way, and she's currently writing a book called How the West Was Lost, which is scheduled for publication with Penguin and Farrar, Strauss and Giroux in 2010. And this book will focus on the 2008 financial crisis. It will explain why we missed the boat in predictions regarding the crisis. But it also talks about how China, Russia, and the Middle East will be in pole position to become the dominant economic players in the 21st century. So it's not as if Dr. Moyo, who is an African by birth, is writing only about Africa. She is a public intellectual with a wide range of experience about the political economy of economic development, whether it's in the third world or the first world or wherever you may identify it. And I think that she may be just the person we need to tell us what we should do with CEDA and where our money is perhaps better spent. So please join me in welcoming Dambisa Moyo. Knock 'em dead.
Hello, good evening. First of all, thank you very much for being here. I have to tell you, I would absolutely not be here. When I was in school, I would never be listening to a boring lecture on a Friday evening. I would definitely be in the pub, so I have no idea what you guys are doing here. But Larry did give me a bit of a clue. He said a number of you are his students, so I guess there's some subtle pressure being put by your professors. Nonetheless, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I realized yesterday when I flew into Toronto that it's my fourth time in Toronto in sort of 4 months. And so, and I hadn't been to Toronto. I'm saying Toronto because that's where I flew in. But it's my first time to Waterloo. And it's a real great pleasure to be back in Canada, I must say. What I thought I would do this evening is talk to you a little bit about, sort of start off by telling you a little bit about some of the experiences that I've had in the past 9-10 months since the book came out. I won't bore you with grave detail, but just to kind of motivate a little bit of the thinking, I'll share with you some of the lessons I've learned and some of the information that I've got from talking to a number of different audiences. And then I will talk to you a little bit about why it is that aid, which is such a great idea, the notion of helping other people who are less fortunate than we are, why it's actually failing and it's making things worse. And then I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the alternative ways of financing development. I have to end up in good news, and there is good news. There's a real opportunity for us as global citizens to actually do something meaningful to transform the African continent. So I hope that will keep you entertained. Again, I'm shocked that you're here, but hey, here we go. I want to just start off by telling you that although people might say, oh, Dambisa Moyo is controversial, or she's anti-aid and so is pro-aid, I want to remind us all that we're actually all on the same side. We're on the same team. And by that, I think it's really important for us to remember that there are at least 3 things that we all agree on. And it doesn't matter whether you're black, white, African, non-African, Republican, Democrat, support Harper or don't, or are pro-aid or anti. It doesn't really matter. We have to remember the 3 things that I believe we agree on. The first thing we agree on is that we do not want Africa to be dependent on aid forever. I think we all look forward to a day when Africa and Africans can be an equal partner on the global stage, when African economies are growing fast enough so that Africans have job opportunities and need not rely on foreign largesse to actually exist. And by the way, if somebody feels like, you know what, we want Africa to remain poor and dependent on aid, you can stop me and put your hand up, and we can have that discussion later. But let's agree that that's one of the key goals, which I do believe we've lost sight of. The second thing I believe we all agree on is that we need African governments to be involved. It's not good enough if Westerners are more interested in Africa than African governments. Nor is it worth anything if African individuals, like myself, are interested in moving the continent forward if actually my government or other governments on the continent are not interested. And it's absolutely pointless, even if Western governments are keen to see Africa grow, but African governments are not. So here we have to be very, very clear. We need African governments on board. We need them to be motivated to do the right thing for the African population. We're not going to get anywhere without that. The third point that I believe we all agree on, which, by the way, I have to tell you up front, is a point that I've stolen from the Minister of International Development in Norway. Is there anybody from Norway here? Anyone? No? Okay, well, some people might be aware that Norway gives about 1% of its income to aid every year. So back in February, I got a phone call from the Norwegian government saying, would I be willing to go and visit? I'd never been to Oslo, and so I thought, you know what the heck? In any case, they were paying, so I thought, well, that might as well go. So I jumped on a flight, and I couldn't understand why it would be the case that the Minister of International Development of a country that gives so much aid would be interested in sitting down and chatting with me. But in any case, I went, and we had very open discussions. And I should tell you, one of the things that I think is uniquely Scandinavian and quite interesting is they love public forums and public debates. And so there's a lot of meetings where people who disagree have an opportunity to sort of throw tomatoes and have big ruckus arguments. But in any case, at one of these meetings, I sat next to Minister Sondheim, Erik Sondheim, who's the Minister of International Development in Norway. And we were debating aid and what the role of aid should be and why it's important. And he said in the middle of the conversation that we have to accept that aid has contributed to the dysfunctionality of African governments, whether we like it or not. And I almost fell off my seat because I thought, gosh, Minister, you're actually helping me make my case. But that's the third point. We have to accept that aid has contributed to the dysfunctionality of African governments. I will come back to this point, but suffice it to say at the moment that the type of dysfunctionality can vary. There are obviously extremes where aid is contributing and has contributed towards corruption and bribery and so on that we read about in the newspapers. But even in the best case scenario, where African governments actually have good intentions to help their citizens, aid allows African governments to abdicate their responsibilities. And I will come back to this point because it's absolutely critical. And it comes down to the point that we have created a society of double standards, where there's one mechanism, one formula, one policy of economic development for the rest of the world, China, Russia, India, Brazil, South Africa, and so on, and a completely different model of economic development for Africa and for Africans, which, by the way, has no evidence of working anywhere. There's no evidence anywhere on earth that a country can achieve long-term economic growth and meaningfully reduce poverty by relying on aid to the extent that African countries rely on aid today. And yet we continue to push an agenda of aid in Africa. I will come back to this point because it's critical. I jumped ahead, actually, because I didn't define for you what exactly I meant by aid. On page 7 of the book, I think it's page 7, I'm getting a bit confused because I have a number of different editions, but somewhere early in the book, I do explain that there are sort of 3 types of aid. And some people might argue that the delineation is a bit faulty, but please bear with me. The first type of aid is humanitarian or emergency aid. So let's suppose there's a tsunami or a flood, a Katrina, an earthquake. I believe that wherever that type of calamity occurs, we as global citizens should act. It doesn't matter where it may be. We have a moral imperative to make sure that we step in when citizens, wherever they may be, are suffering from a calamity, as I just suggested. So my book is not about humanitarian or emergency aid. The second type of aid is what I'd call charitable NGO aid. As Larry mentioned in the introduction, I myself sit on a number of charities, education charities, and a charity that gives helps rehabilitate orphans. But it's important for us to remember that those type of interventions are not going to make Africa grow at the levels of growth that we need it to grow at to make sure that we're creating jobs and growing at a level to reduce poverty. So let us not delude ourselves when we send $10 a month for a child to go to school in Zambia, which is where I'm from, or to send $3 a month for a child, for a well to be built in rural Ghana, for example. Because yes, it might make us feel better, but let's be realistic that these economies will not grow rapidly enough to remove poverty based on that type of intervention. And just so you know, the United Nations estimates that African countries have to grow at about 7% a year in order to meaningfully put a dent in poverty. Does anybody have an idea of how fast Africa is growing now or what the expectations are for this year? I hear you guys love economics. That's right. It is about between 1.5 and 1.8. The IMF had forecasted that Africa was going to grow at around 3%. They reduced their forecasts back in April. And part of that is because of the financial crisis. But on average, African countries, only in the last sort of 10 years, have actually done reasonably well. So compared to the 7% that we need to target, we're not doing that well. So these first two types of aid are not what I'm talking about in my book. These two types of aid have a lot of problems. However, that's for the sequel. That's not for this book. This book focuses on the third type of aid, which is the billions of dollars that go from government to government, or from development institutions like the World Bank and the IMF to African governments every year. Does anybody have an idea of what that amount is? Any guesses? How much money, at least how much money is going to Africa every year in that type of aid? Do you want to take a guess, anybody? How much? That's for the Iraq war. That's not for... How much? No, it's not quite $1 trillion. It's about $100 billion a year. The total amount of aid that has gone to Africa in the past 60 years is over $1 trillion. That's over $100 for every man, woman, and child on the earth today. So my book is about the failure of that third type of aid, and it is the largest amount of aid. I want to take us back to the 1950s so we understand why it is the case that this type of aid actually emerged. The Bretton Woods institutions, such as the World Bank and the IMF, were outgrowths of World War II. And after World War II, as many of you will know, the Marshall Plan was put in place to help reconstruction of Europe and post-World War II. The amount of money that went to Europe at that time was about $100 billion in today's terms. And that money was sent over a 5-year period in Marshall Plan. And was met with a lot of success. And I have to confess that had I been a policymaker or commentator at that time, I definitely would have been a supporter of aid. It made sense. And the idea was very simple. Policymakers sat down and said, you know what, this Marshall Plan's worked perfectly in Europe. Many African countries and countries around the world were just coming out of colonialism and were becoming independent states. And economists sat down and they said there's a very simple equation. Savings leads to investment, and investment leads to growth, and it's growth that reduces poverty. Very simple. The only problem was, in places like Africa, the countries were so fragmented and quite small, and there were a lot of subsistence farmers, so there was not enough savings to lead to investment, and investment to lead to growth, and growth to reduce poverty. So they had this idea, well, instead of using, since there's no savings, let's add in the aid money. So aid would be money coming from abroad. That money would spur investment, which would lead to growth and would lead to poverty reduction. Makes sense. Here we are now, over 50 years later, and I can tell you the following. In terms of growth, Africa is worse today than it was in 1970, both in terms of the rates of growth, as we just talked about, so at 1.8, but also of the levels of income. Africans, on the whole, are poorer than they were in 1970. A second statistic for you is that in the 1970s, 10% of Africans lived on less than $1 a day. Today, over 70% of Africans live on less than $1 a day. This is after $1 trillion of aid money that's gone to this continent. Are we supposed to sit back and relax and not question the fact that our great idea has not worked? As I was saying over dinner, there is no way a company or a government, a political party, could survive for 60 years with this scorecard. And yet, we as a global society turn a blind eye to Africa. I should also tell you that we have tried many different ways of delivering the aid. So in the 1960s, there was a lot of focus on aid for infrastructure. In the 1970s, we thought, you know what, that's not such a good idea. We want to target poverty. In the 1980s, they threw away that idea and said we're going to focus on structural adjustment and stabilization policies to try and get more private sector involved. In the 1990s, the pendulum swung back and people said they didn't like the structural adjustment programs, and the focus became democracy and governance. We're now in the 2000s, and it's become a free-for-all. The African agenda has been completely hijacked by celebrities. It's outrageous. And I say this as an African, that you rarely hear from African leaders about what the plan is to reduce poverty and to get our economy growing. The people who attend the G20 meetings, the World Economic Forum, the big meetings discussing Africa are actually the celebrities. And that is a double standard, because that is something that you as Canadians or international citizens would never tolerate for your own societies. Can you imagine a situation where President Obama doesn't say anything about the financial crisis or the fact that 10% of Americans, 1 in 10 Americans, is out of work, but instead maybe Mick Jagger is out there talking about it? It would be intolerable. But somehow, we as global citizens have found that quite comfortable where Africa is concerned. You should not want to hear from me this evening. You should want to hear from African leaders. And yet, if I asked you now to name 3 African leaders, I'm sure many of you would struggle. I should also point out for you that over 60% of Africans are under the age of 24. That's right, over 60% of Africans are under the age of 24. We have a very, very young population. In some countries, over 50% of the population is under the age of 15. So we've got a young population, and many people in here who have been to Africa will know what I'm talking about when I say if you go to the big cities in Africa, Lagos, Nairobi, Lusaka, there are lots of young people all over the streets selling trinkets from China, DVDs, T-shirts, geese, mirrors. I'm sure people know what I'm talking about. The question then becomes, what's going to happen in 10 years? Many of these people are like the high school students that are in the audience. They've gone through high school, and they can read and write, but there are no job opportunities. This is the state of the African continent in many places today. Before I go into the specific reasons why it is that aid, which is a good idea, is failing to do what it's supposed to do, remember, create growth and reduce poverty, I just want to also say that there's a fundamental problem with the celebrity culture that I want to highlight here. First of all, their whole PR agenda is negative. I accept that they do have many followers. Many of us love their music. But why use the platform to push a negative agenda? In the book, I talk about the 4 horsemen of Africa's apocalypse. The fact that we always focus on things like war, disease, corruption, and poverty when we think about Africa. We seem to forget that there are more poor Chinese people on earth than there are poor Africans. There are more poor Indians on earth than there are poor Africans. And yet we don't feel sorry for the Chinese, nor do we feel sorry for the Indians. And you rarely see on television pictures of poor Chinese children starving or living in a destitute way. So in your minds and in the minds of many people, including potential investors into our economies that could create jobs, there's only a picture of destitution and despair when it comes to the African continent. We're suffering from a serious PR disaster, and unfortunately, the celebrities have capitalized on that. I wish they would use their platform to push a positive message about the African people. That would help to create jobs and to bring other investment from outside. I want to now spend a bit of time talking to you about why it is specifically that aid is not working. I should tell you that my background has tainted my image and my perspective in the sense that most of my arguments are economic or political science arguments. I don't know if anybody in here has actually had the opportunity to meet President Kagame of Rwanda, but if you have not, I will just share with you that a lot of his thinking about why aid is a problem is much more philosophical. In fact, he said to me that any country in Africa that relies on aid has not had a genocide. And I thought that was quite extreme, but his point is very simple, that you cannot have a society that is dependent on the international community when the international community can pick up and leave and leave you in the most destitute of ways, as happened in Rwanda 15 years ago. But his discussion about the demerits of aid is very different, and I would encourage you to have a look at an article that President Kagame wrote for the Financial Times in February, if you're interested in this. It's a very interesting article, and one of the things that he says that really struck a chord with me is that people should remember that they don't care about our continent more than we do. And there is this subtle impression that somehow we as Africans don't care about our continent as much as you do, but we do. And we are really trying hard to turn the corner, and that's why we need your help. I have a list that I usually go around with, which is the top 10 reasons why aid doesn't work. And it never works in Europe, but when I come to North America, people are like, yeah, that's kind of David Letterman. But rather than give you all 10 points, I'm going to actually just give you a little sneak preview so that you actually go out and buy the book. But let's start off with the most obvious reason as to why it is aid is not working. And the simple reason is that much of the aid is stolen. Some of the people who don't like my book have written to me and said, oh, Dambisa, what are you talking about? The whole aid thing about aid money being stolen is an old story. That's from Mobutu days in the 1970s. All I can say is, boy, are they wrong. I don't know which African media they've been looking at. Sadly, even today, aid money is stolen. It tends to be free money that's handed out to African governments, many of them corrupt, not all of them, but many of them corrupt. In my own country, the former Zambian president is embroiled, as we speak, in a big corruption scandal, having stolen money. And right next door to us in Malawi, the Malawian government is also prosecuting the former president for having stolen about $12 to $15 million, which was earmarked for HIV/AIDS, which I should tell you is pretty small money. I mean, there are billions of dollars that have been stolen in other countries. But the point here is that aid money goes into these countries and it is stolen. It creates an environment of corruption, and it's very, very difficult to get rid of that corruption once it's seeped in. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a reason why African countries are consistently ranked amongst the most corrupt countries on earth. Every year, Transparency International, which is a not-for-profit organization, ranks countries by the degree of corruption, something called the Corruption Perceptions Index. Consistently, African countries are at the bottom. The money that has been stolen is not just oil money, but also aid money. And that is something we have to accept. There is a wide literature. That's not my literature from my kitchen that I cooked up, but it's a wide literature that has been written by donor agencies themselves: CEDA, the World Bank, IMF, DFID, which is from the UK, USAID, talking about the failure of aid. So have a look at the back of my book. I'll give a lot of references of their own research of why aid is failing. Some of the other things they talk about is the fact that aid leads to inflation. Aid leaves African countries with unsustainable debt burdens, huge debt burdens that we as African and generations to come will have to pay for. Aid leads to Dutch disease. Very simply, I'll tell you what Dutch disease is. It's a lot of money flowing into a country, so you get all these dollars flowing into a small country like my country, and that means that there are fewer domestic kwacha, which is our domestic currency, and if our currency becomes so strong, it means that nobody wants to buy Zambian goods. It's too expensive. This is, again, very well researched in the literature. As I said earlier, a big problem with the aid regime is that it allows our governments to abdicate their responsibilities of providing goods to us. You might be saying, what goods? Well, what type of a society do you live in? In Canada, your government is required to provide you with public goods. In economics, the term public goods is used to explain things like a lamp post that everybody benefits from, but actually no one person pays for it. Other types of public goods are things like education, healthcare, infrastructure, and security. So coming here today from Toronto, I was on a beautiful, smooth road. Well, not one person paid for that. It's actually a lot of people are benefiting, and actually the government is the one who's underwritten or has paid for that road to be constructed. In Africa, public goods such as education, healthcare, infrastructure, and even security are paid for by the aid community. Now, you might sit here and say, well, so what? What's the big deal with that? Well, there are at least two problems with it. First of all, we cannot allow our societies to remain dependent on societies that have a crisis of the financial system. I will give you a specific example. In my country, which has a population of 10 million people, about 1 in 3 Zambians is HIV positive. By all measures, it's an epidemic, and it's a serious problem. However, about 98%, between 95 and 98% of the infrastructure, the medicines, the doctors, the nurses, the infrastructure that's provided to combat the disease comes from USAID. That's the United States Agency for International Development. Again, you might say that's a great thing. Well, it's not, because America, as you know, is suffering right now from a financial crisis. Itself, it is borrowing from China. It has a 10% unemployment rate, as I mentioned earlier. So the priority for the American government is to get its own economy upright and off of its knees. Does it make sense for the Zambian government or the Zambian people to sit back and relax and rely on America, which itself has a massive debt to GDP ratio, to underwrite our financial system, to underwrite our healthcare, our education, our security and infrastructure? It seems to me that leaves us way too vulnerable. If America's problems are exacerbated, why should we not get a phone call from President Obama saying, I'm afraid we're not going to be able to help you this year? What then happens to all the Zambians that are sitting around waiting for that largesse? These are the fundamental questions we should be asking, instead of just pushing for more aid. The second problem with a system where African governments have been allowed to abdicate their responsibility is that African governments very rarely care about what Africans think. They spend much more of their time, and by the way, it's the right thing for them to do, much more of their time courting and catering to the donors' needs. If SIDA wants to see them, they'll fly over to see SIDA. If the International World Bank or the IMF wants to visit with them and hear what they're doing, they'll spend more time with them rather than listening to what Africans want and need. So no surprises, we have many governments in Africa that have been in power for many years, and they're happy to live or die in office, and they do based on not what the African people think, but what the donors are giving them. This is the problem with aid. There are other problems with aid as well. It kills off entrepreneurship. The fact that aid money is pooling at the state level means that very rarely are African governments incentivized to do the right thing to grow these economies. African countries still have a lot of trade barriers domestically. Very often, it can take up to 2 years to get a business license. In fact, every year the World Bank publishes a survey called Doing Business Around the World. And consistently, African countries are at the bottom as the most difficult places to do business. Does that sound to you like a place where governments are interested in giving their young people employment and opportunities to be entrepreneurs? The answer to me is no. There's a wide literature on the fact that aid contributes to civil wars and civil unrest. People like Grossman, Paul Collier, who was my PhD supervisor, have spent a lot of time talking about the fact that money, again, pools at the state level, and what you have is because there's nothing else going on in these economies, people are constantly fighting to take over the government. It should come as no surprise to you that this year Africa has had 4 coups. 4 coups. So 4 governments have been overthrown in Africa by forced measures in 2009. I should tell you also, and perhaps it will not come as a surprise to some people in here, that in the 1990s there was more civil unrest, more war, and more clashes in Africa than the rest of the world put together. When I say there are 4 coups in Africa this year, I'm not including the civil unrest that continues in places like Zimbabwe or in Somalia. I'm talking about countries where the government was completely overthrown. This is a problem. If you ignore everything I say tonight, I do hope that you will remember the one point, that aid disenfranchises Africans. You rarely hear from Africans because we're disenfranchised on the whole. How does aid do that? Well, I will remind you of a saying in the United States around the Boston Tea Party, which is no taxation without representation. In Africa, we have what I consider is the reverse Boston Tea Party. We have no representation because there's no taxation. And as I said to you, until African governments live or die based on our votes in Africa, instead of donor aid, we will never get a situation where we are enfranchised. We will always be second-rate citizens. Anyway, now that I've given you the bad news, I can give you the good news. And the good news is we have just witnessed China move 300 million people out of poverty in 30 years. Paul Collier, as I mentioned, my PhD supervisor, says Africa is shearing off. So the rest of the world is going in one direction and Africa is going in a completely different direction. So we are at a time where we've seen places like India, and by the way, India now has the largest middle class in the world. 450 million Indians are in the middle class. This has happened in our lifetime. Places like China, places like India are growing at remarkable rates. Places like Russia, Brazil. But it's not just those countries. Even on the African continent, places like South Africa and Botswana are meaningfully putting a dent in poverty. How are they doing that? By not relying on aid. So what is it that they're focused on? What is this toolkit that these countries have used to spur growth and to create jobs that the rest of Africa is not using? That's the question. I've written here a number of things that governments can and should and do use, not just Western governments like Canada or the United States or Britain, but countries like the ones I've just listed out to you in the emerging markets. They focus on things like trade. They focus on things like foreign direct investment, the capital markets, so borrowing from the international markets, microfinance, remittances, taxes, savings. There's a whole list of alternative ways of financing that are much better because they are much more transparent. With the aid system, if a government behaves in a bad way, it doesn't matter. He can get more aid next year. With the capital markets, if you behave badly, the markets will shut down on you. The beauty with something like trade is that the benefits are broad-based. The guy who's actually selling cows or beef to the international market actually gets paid the money directly. The problem with the aid system is the money pools at one level. So let's take a look at a couple of these things. In the trade sector, for example, African produce continues to be excluded because of farm subsidies from the major markets. So we're not allowed to sell our goods into your markets. This is a problem. Every year, Africa loses about $300 billion in lost export income because of the subsidies. However, it's not just the subsidies that are coming from outside. Even within the African continent, many African countries have very high tariffs and trade barriers between themselves. Sometimes in the double digits, could be as high as 30%. This is a problem. Does this sound to us like countries that have got it right, that are really interested in seeing their economies grow? To me, the answer is no. I've already talked a little bit about foreign direct investment and the fact that it can take an absolute long time to actually get a business started. In fact, doing business in many places in Africa is an absolute nightmare. I went from Rwanda to Kenya to Tanzania, and these are three countries that are right near each other. And I needed to change my currency 3 times and get 3 visas. My perspective, I was looking at it and thinking about it from the perspective of an investor. That's a nightmare. Why is it that countries in Africa cannot come together and form economic unions? There's a lot of talk about this, a lot, but very little action. So I won't go into detail on the other issues, and I just want to spend a little bit of time telling you what my policy recommendation is. My policy recommendation is that we need to put in place an aid policy where we all know that at some point the aid system is going to come to an end. So we need to wean countries off of aid. Now, I've been misquoted. I never said we should have a 5-year blanket policy. That would be completely ridiculous. Somalia obviously is different from Zambia, which is different from Ghana. You cannot have one blanket policy for all countries. And I think focusing on the 5 years detracts from the fundamental point, which is that the type of aid, to the extent that aid has worked, whether it's the Marshall Plan or whether it's through what we call the aid graduates, has worked when the interventions of aid have been short, sharp, and finite. The problem in Africa is that aid is an open-ended commitment. There's no discussion about when it's going to end, and it's viewed by policymakers in Africa as permanent income. This is the root cause of the problem. I'm going to end up now by giving you a quote. 2 quotes, actually. One of them, in fact, they both are around the same point, which is that why it is that we continue to push an agenda of aid to Africa when we know it doesn't work, that there's no evidence that it works anywhere, nor do we have, but at the same time we have evidence of the things that do work, that have got China to do amazing things in India and so on. The first point comes from George W. Bush, and I am shocked I'm quoting him, but here we go. And he said we should all be careful of the soft bigotry of low expectations. And that's what this is about. People have very little faith in the African population. They have very little faith in Africa. And that has got to change. And that's why I was talking about the PR issue. Until we start to view Africans as equals, as people we can really have a discussion with, people we can actually invest in, this conversation is moot, and things are only going to get worse. The other quote comes from a Nigerian friend of mine who's very chatty. And he said to me, Dambisa, why are you wasting your time writing this book? Everybody knows that aid doesn't work. He goes, in fact, do you know why it is that people keep pushing this aid model? And I said, no, why? And he said, Africa is to development what Mars is to NASA. He said, every year we spend hundreds of millions of dollars doing research, writing reports, analysis, experiments. He says, but nobody actually believes we're ever going to live in Mars. And the problem is that nobody actually believes that Africa could develop. I will leave it there and take your questions. Thank you so much for being here on a Friday night. Thank you.
Questions? I'll help identify people.
Okay.
Professor John.
Thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
I came to your talk because I had heard you speak on CPC and admired your eloquence.
Thank you very much. You're right in the sense that your point about not focusing on the African success stories, and there are many. In the book, I do talk about some of the successes, and it is about making sure we get some traction. However, I'm going to quote General McChrystal here. This is my new thing. I loved his quote. I don't know if people who know who General McChrystal is. Is this American representative for, I think it's U.S. Army for Afghanistan. And he said something to the effect of, we need to be realistic about where we are, not where we want to be. And so the notion of ruralization is completely absurd, with all due respect. We are expecting by 2050 for there to be about 40 million people living in Lagos, which is, for those people who haven't been, is a collection of small islands in the capital city of Nigeria. We might want to sit here and think about ruralization, but even in my own country of Zambia, about 70% of the population lives on the line of rail in the cities, and nobody's going to go to the farmland. Tilling the land is difficult. It's hard to sell your goods internationally. As I said, what is the benefit of us going back to the rural area? Coming to your point about micro versus macro, we're trying to move as many people out of poverty as possible. Micro interventions, I did mention actually that I'm involved in some NGOs, and I deliberately have not focused on NGOs. Yes, we can save lives. Yes, a girl can go to school, but that is not going to get us to get to the magic 7% number. And you might say, oh, well, that's a macro thinking, but the fact of the matter is we're trying to get as many Africans as possible out of poverty. I look forward to the day when somebody could stand here and say 300 million Africans have been moved out of poverty in 30 years. That is what we're trying to get at. We're not trying to create millennium villages or these small kind of subsistence levels. We're trying to be part of the global society. And sending Africans back into the rural area is not going to allow us to be part of the global society. It's sending us back into the previous centuries. So that would be my response to those questions. Okay. Well, actually, my book is split 50-50. The negative being aid, which is why it's a critique of aid in the first half, and the second half being about the alternatives positive. There's a solution. There are solutions. And some of the solutions I've just rattled through here, things like remittances and trade and foreign direct investment and so on. I mean, so basically, the thesis is about financing development. How can we finance development better? And I'm arguing that you can do that by using more transparent tools of financing. And I think this kind of is a good segue to your first question, which is about accountability. Just to be clear, I'm not saying that aid is the only source of corruption on earth. That clearly is not the case, as Enron and other things have shown us. But the point I'm making is that other forms of financing are more transparent. So, for example, in order to get money from the international capital markets through a bond, you have to have a credit rating. People can then see whether you're improving and doing the things that you as a government have claimed that you want to do. I'll give you a specific example of South Africa. When I used to work in finance, very early on, South Africa was what they call a double B rated country, which is kind of middling, I would say, maybe even on the low side. Over the time that I was working in the financial markets, so about 8 years, South Africa has steadily improved. It's gone from a double B to a triple B, so 3 Bs, and it's now a single A country, that is direct progress. Anybody who works in the financial markets can see that this country is improving. And that type of credibility, type of transparency is not something that you see in the aid markets. Aid goes to every country, in fact, even including Zimbabwe, countries that we very publicly condemn. We still hand them aid in private. So my point here with something like accountability, I think if you get more transparent ways of financing where there's a penalty for bad behavior, where actually governments cannot just get away with doing the wrong things, that type of financing is better and it creates a sense of discipline. Something like taxes is another way of financing development. President Obama, for example, knows that if he does the wrong thing, the American taxpayer will vote him out at the next election. But in Africa, that's not the case. In many places in Africa, it doesn't matter if there are no taxes being collected because the government knows that it's in office based on aid money. So that would be my answer to that.
Question here. Yes, ma'am. You need to speak loudly, please.
Do people know what the Paris Agenda is? No? Okay, so there was the Paris Agenda, I think it was 2005, and then it was followed by the Accra Accord. They like these big buzzwords. And basically both of them are talking about making African governments more of partners. They're leading the charge in terms of actually putting the agenda, the development agenda, forward. So instead of sort of shoving down the agenda onto them, they come up with ideas about how they would think that agenda should be, development agenda should be pursued. I think a lot of people won't like what I have to say. I actually think there are two types of people. I think that there are realists and there are those who are delusional. And I think that by and large, I'm going to say I've been both. I hope that I've actually evolved from a delusional to a realist. But I would say the way I would categorize it is by and large, people who are delusional are people who do have big ideas, and that's great. We need them to have, to push society forward. But actually, they kind of brush over the details. So I would say politicians and people who kind of think more with their hearts than with their heads tend to be, I would say, more delusional. They don't focus on the bottom line. They don't focus on how we're going to pay for this. They don't worry about the fact that there might be a pension crisis looming in Europe, and what does that mean for financing aid. They're not concerned about the details. The realists spend their time looking at the numbers and they get worried. And I would consider myself a realist. I'm worried because starting from 2010, the European population is going to start declining, according to Eurostat. Well, you might say, well, what does that mean? Well, if the European population starts declining, that means their GDP, the amount that's being produced in Europe, will start to shrink. If that starts to shrink, that obviously means that the proportion of aid money, the amount of aid money going to Africa is going to decline. So African governments should not be sitting back and relaxing, saying, oh, Europe is going to give us more money, when Europe has a serious pension problem that we all know. And by the way, 2010 is just a couple of weeks away now, a few weeks away. More specifically to your point, I think that the one problem with this whole development agenda is that there has been so much talk. I mean, I am sick and tired of the talk and very, very little action. I've given you a few examples of this, and in terms of trade policy, in terms of investment policy, regional integration, and frankly, I spend a lot of time thinking about this. I think to myself, if tomorrow somebody said to me, okay, you're responsible for policy in Africa, it's such low-hanging fruit. There's so many easy things that can be done that could be so meaningful, not only in making people on the ground much more excited about what could happen in the continent, but also in actually spurring economic development. Now, you might be saying, oh, no, she's becoming a delusional. Let me give you some examples, because I'm a realist. Here are some specific examples. Example number one. In Ethiopia has 100 million people. Okay, that's a huge population. It has about 2% mobile phone penetration. That means about 2% of Ethiopians have a mobile phone. The African country average is 30%. Okay, so 30% of Africans in the country have mobile phones. Meanwhile, there are at least 30 countries around the world. Is everybody with me here? 30 countries in the world where mobile phone penetration is more than 100%. So what does that mean? It means that there are more than 30 countries where people have more than one mobile phone. Okay? So why am I telling you this story? Here is a situation where a government has a deliberate policy not to liberalize the mobile phone network. They've said, nope, we are not allowing other people to give mobile phones to Ethiopians. Some of you might say, that's not a bad thing. I'm sick and tired of hearing ringtones. However, at the same time, we have a lot of evidence of the positive things that mobile phones can do for economic development. I'm going to give you some examples. In Ghana, there's a lot of evidence that mobile phones are now being used to trade produce. So a farmer will send a text and say, town A, I have a cow, how much are you going to pay me? He gets a text back, $20. He says, if I bring a cow to town B, how much are you going to pay me? I'll pay you $40. He takes the cow to town B. A lot of evidence of that type of thing, income generation using the mobile phone. But in Kenya, there's also a lot of evidence that mobile phones are being used to improve people's health care. So people get texts, doctors coming to your area in 2 weeks' time, on this day, at this time. So there's clearly evidence that people's livelihoods can be improved by mobile telephones. However, you have a government specifically sitting there and saying, we're not going to give any more licenses to allow other people to have mobile phones. You might say that one's quite esoteric. Let me give you a couple more very quickly. In many African countries, there are public officials, including my own in Zambia. If a minister gets sick, he's sent abroad on the Zambian taxpayer, or I should say on your taxpaying bill, because you're the guys who are giving us aid. So he goes to South Africa or to London, fully paid, and a lavish expenditure. President Kagame of Rwanda actually banned that, and he said, if you're the Minister of Health of Rwanda and you don't want to be treated in your own hospital, then you're not doing your job. So he basically banned that. Another example of something that they've done in Rwanda, which I think is fantastic, no government official has a government car. You have to use your own private cars. The number of accidents has gone down, little bumps and all this. Nobody has a public vehicle. Automatically, the amount of government expenditure has gone down. Mobile phones, talking about mobile phones, the government has banned, has capped the amount of mobile phone usage that a civil service servant can use. So, for example, he'll say every civil servant gets $50 a month mobile phone usage. If you go to $60, you have to pay the additional. These things sound very simple, but if you're poor and you need to tighten your belt, these are the aggressive type of things that you need to do, and that money that's being saved is being channeled into education and healthcare. That's what I call low-hanging fruit. Things like regional integration, as I talked about before. Zambia by itself, 10 million people. Who cares? Southern Africa together, 200 million people. That's very interesting. People now want to think about investing there, building infrastructure around that. But you know what? There are so many. We have multiple currencies. The 9 countries in that region each have their own currency, each have their own passport, own airline. This does not sound like a formula for long-term economic growth. So all of this is to say there are some very basic, simple things that can be done. We don't need the flowery language of Paris Accord and Accra this and all that. We know what needs to be done. Somebody just has to pull the trigger. I have a section in the book called Who's Going to Bell the Cat? And I think that's the issue. Somebody has to stand up and say, you know what, enough of this talk. I don't want to hear any more about this partnership, this agreement. We don't need that. We just need people to actually implement. So less of the delusion, much more of the realism, I think.
I noticed that China is very interested in Africa. I was wondering if you could comment on that. I noticed that China is very interested in Africa, and I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Yes. There's a chapter in my book called The Chinese Are Our Friends. I actually think what the Chinese are doing in Africa is fantastic. First of all, we've got a new suitor in town. I mean, I'm sure many of us know when you only have one person chasing you, well, it's a bit unexciting. But if you've got 2 people chasing you, well, then there's a bit of competition going on there. So all of a sudden now, we don't have to just focus on the West. We can now start to think about all their other alternatives. But more fundamentally, the thing about the Chinese is that they're not coming to Africa with big aspirations of democracy or religion and so on. They're coming to Africa to do business. And that means there's a real opportunity for us as Africans, if our policymakers behave in the right way, to benefit. We need jobs. That's what people keep forgetting. We need jobs. And the Chinese are bringing jobs. There's actually, in the book, I talk about the Pew Survey. I know this is a very unpopular view because people are always trying to feel sorry for the Africans. It's neocolonialism. No, it's not. We need jobs. So, let them come in. Let's see what they can do. In the book, I talk about the Pew Survey, which is an American organization who went to about 15 countries in Africa and asked Africans, what do you think about the Chinese here? Are they better or worse? Do you like them? Do you not? And consistently, by wide margins, Ethiopia, Ghana, Zambia, across the continent, Africans said, love the Chinese, giving us jobs, giving us a real opportunity. In fact, we like them better than the Americans. And so this is what's happening on the ground. They are not perfect. There are obviously things like labor issues, environmental issues. These are of great concern, not just for us on the African continent, but the world in general. But that is where African policymaking needs to step in. If China lends money to America, nobody's worried about the Americans being abused or neo-colonized because we know that the American policymaker is going to ensure that the Chinese behave in the right way. In Africa, there's a lot of upside from the Chinese coming there. In fact, this week alone, they've announced another $10 billion that they're giving to Africa. I think that's all great as long as our policymakers are acting on our behalf.
I just have two quick questions. The first thing is, over time, I've listened to you speak at many places, and I've read your book. And I just want to know, like, if you could delete a line in your book.
Especially the absence of good policy.
Those are very good questions. What would I delete? It's funny you say that because having been on the road, and I've had a crazy schedule this year, going around meeting so many interesting people, being in settings such as this one, and also meeting a number of policymakers. I actually realized that if I had met people, particularly the policymakers, the donors and the African leaders, before I had finished the book, it would have been much more scathing. So I think it would have been even worse. And I have to tell you this quick story before I tell you what I would delete. The thing that I found most shocking was a trip that I made to the IMF. And I sat down. It was Chatham House rule, which is basically, whatever goes on in this room, I'm not allowed to repeat, but it was so shocking I have to repeat it. And there must have been 8 of us in the room, senior IMF officials, and they said, you know what, Dambisa, we've got to tell you that, we don't agree with everything in your book, but we really like it because, at least you're able to say the things that you're saying, that basically they were not in a position to say these things because we've become so absurd with this PC nonsense that people can, there's an elephant in the room and everybody is ignoring it. People are dying and nobody wants to question the aid system. But the thing that I thought was absolutely shocking was that the IMF official, one guy, was saying that of, call it 50 countries in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, only two out of the 50 would the IMF feel comfortable leaving the African government to write a strategy report about the economy. So let me say that again. There are basically only 2 countries in Africa that the IMF feels that the government is working efficiently. The other, call it 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, they do not feel comfortable that the government could even write an article about education in the system. Now, I honestly could not believe this. I was absolutely stunned and outraged. And I realized it's not in capacity, which is what people are going to say, it's capacity building, they don't have good educated Africans, which we all know is crap, excuse my French. The fact of the matter is because African governments have abdicated their responsibilities. They know somebody else is going to write it. They know an NGO is going to say, me, I'll write your healthcare report. That is the problem. But that's the system we live in, that the IMF is sitting there telling me, an African, a stakeholder, and I'm not upset with them, but I just thought it was so shocking that we live in a time where African governments cannot even put together a report on healthcare or education. Completely allows somebody else to do it. What would I take out? It's very hard, actually, and I know it sounds very arrogant, but probably not much, actually. The only thing I probably would really rethink is the 5 years, because I think people are, and the 5 years, I don't know if people don't know about this, but in the book I give an example. What if Western donors called up African governments and said, listen, we're giving you 5 years and then we're going to turn off the aid tap? What would happen in Africa? And people have said, oh my God, Dambisa is going to kill African babies and this and that, and because she wants to put in this policy of switching off aid in 5 years. I never said that, and I feel like that might have blurred the issue. That maybe at a stretch I would take it out. I'm not too sure. Alternatives. Yes, I think that, how sure are we? Well, we have the counterfactual. We have a lot of countries that were poorer than African countries 40 years ago. South Korea was poorer than Ghana. Indonesia was poorer than Nigeria. Today, in fact, this week, Monday, I was attending an OECD meeting. South Korea is the newest member of the OECD. It's gone from, as my mother likes to say, from horse to rider. In this case, it's gone from a recipient of aid to a donor of aid in again, 30 years. So is there evidence that this other elixir of trade in foreign direction works? Absolutely. And as I said, it's not just in these far-flung countries, even on South Africa. It has made significant strides. Things like hot money, corruption in banks, absolutely, but that's why we need to be more vigilant. And I liked President Obama's inaugural speech where he said, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's worth having a look, he said, we shouldn't we should remember that the free market system is still the best system we have at creating wealth and creating freedom. And I think we can all get excited and say, oh, no, but the banks are bad and, there's so much corruption and hot money. Yes, these are problems, but there's ways that policymakers can act to make sure that we can benefit. So, for example, with hot money in Chile, you can't trade in and out of the market. You have to be there for at least 2 years. There are things like that, capital controls. I mean, there are ways to do it so that you still get the market benefits, but at the same time, the government provides some stability into the market. Let me stop there. Okay. Thank you very much for that. First of all, I don't think I said that all African governments don't care. I've given you examples of some governments that are doing some interesting things, such as Rwanda. Ghana is another place where I think there's been significant improvements. In fact, the Ghanaian government, the new government, is entitled to 2 terms. He's already said he's only need to do 1 term. There are some good things. I don't want to leave people with the impression that it's absolutely all doom and gloom. What I am saying is that we've got a lot of work to do, and it's not being done. But obviously, places like Ghana, President Wade of Senegal has talked about the failure of the aid system. President Kagame, as I said, Rwanda is ranked the most improved on that World Bank doing business survey that I talked about. So there are countries doing the right thing. South Africa and Botswana are the obvious ones. So please don't misquote or misunderstand what I was saying. I'm not saying that all African governments do not care. That's not what I'm saying. People not wanting Africans to prosper, and you give the example of the IMF. A few months ago, I had dinner with a South African friend of mine. And I was kind of ranting and raving and saying, I'm really annoyed at the fact that Africa continues to be portrayed in such a negative light. Look at the media and so on. And he said to me something which I think was quite poignant at the time, and it got me to shut up pretty quickly, which was that, I had to accept that these are not made-up stories. They actually exist. So it's not like somebody, put a man on the moon in a Hollywood studio and then convinced us that it's actually somebody made a step on the moon. It's not like that where aid is concerned. It's not like somehow people are making films about Africa that aren't true. A lot of what we do see about people starving, about the corrupt despots, about disease, about war, there are true things that are happening on the African continent. My point is that those are not the only things that are happening, and I think that's where it's really important. So I actually don't like the idea of blaming other people. Oh, it's the IMF, oh, it's the donors, because actually we can vote with our feet. If we don't like the IMF so much, why don't we tell them that we're not interested in their programs anymore and do something different? The problem is, we can sit back ipso facto and say, oh, well, the IMF was bad because of structural adjustment. But what have we done since then? And frankly, I think the answer is not much. The 7%, yeah, again, here's a good example of where we should be asking the hard questions. Okay, so we grow about 5% instead of 7%. Zambia, and like many other African countries, over the past 10 years, has done well on the back of the commodity boom. Nobody is asking the question, what happened to the money that the country's made? I don't hear that at all. Every time people talk about Africa, oh my God, Africa is going to suffer from the financial crisis. Africa is going to, you have many more people fall into poverty. That may be true, but what happened to the money? As a Zambian, I want to know. We've just come out of one of the biggest booms in commodity. We're a major producer of copper. What has happened to the money? Nobody's answering that question. The question about the prescription of the capital markets, yes, you're right. There has been a fundamental problem in the system. However, North America and Europe are not the only places where you can issue debt in the markets. I talk about China, Middle East being places where you can issue a bond. In fact, many companies are now listing in Hong Kong. And I think it's that type of innovation. I think we let the Africa debate down because we're not innovative. Some of the most innovative things that do come out in the development space come out from lone rangers in different places, like Mohammed Yunus coming up with Grameen Bank from Bangladesh, or Hernando de Soto coming up with the notion of property rights. He's sitting in Peru. But the big development agencies are disappointing in the sense that we spend a lot of money, billions of dollars, hundreds of people, thousands of people, focusing on development issues, but not being innovative. So something like the capital markets, my view is there are ways to get around the limitations of the capital markets so that it can be more effective and better use to finance economic development.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. Yes, sir.
Okay, so I don't know if people up there heard him, but basically the question is, what is the link between the market-based solutions that I proposed in the book and things like social interventions like healthcare and political? I guess by political you must mean like democracy. Is that right? Okay. So I would say think of it as, and there's a great paper entitled Could Africa Be Like America? And think of it like that. The way you run your system of healthcare and of education is by financing through taxes. So the point is we need to create the jobs. Once you get the jobs, the government can then raise financing through taxation. So you get the investment in, you create the investment climate. People think, wow, I can go and open a business in East Africa. It's easy for me to do business there. I don't have hurdles. I have to take 2 years to get a business license. I'm going to invest my money in there, hire some local people to work there. Those people get an income. That income gets taxed. The government uses that taxed money to finance education and healthcare, which is exactly what happens in Canada. That's the social part. The political part, and I think it's very interesting what's happening in Africa right now, is also, I believe, very simple. I talk about this in the book. We all want to live under a free and fair banner, and democracy is great for that. But the fact of the matter is that democracy is kind of pointless if it doesn't stick. And the fact that in fact, there's great literature, I talk about it in the book by some economists, that talk about the fact that you cannot get democracy to stick until you reach a certain level of income. And in fact, even places like Thailand, you still get coups because they haven't yet reached the requisite level of income. What's the reason for that? Well, my argument is that you need a critical mass of middle-class people. They are the ones who have the tax base and they can hold the government accountable. I think there's a very disturbing trend that's emerging in Africa right now, which is what I call patchwork democracies. So the international community is now convincing the oppositions in places like Zimbabwe and Kenya to join the government, and then you have no opposition anymore. Look at Zimbabwe. Whenever Tsvangirai now complains, they say, well, you're not part of the government, so what do you want us to do? And that is because there's not been enough time for us in Africa to have a big enough middle class. Again, the middle class emerging from having higher incomes. You get the income, you get the investment, you get the income, you get more demand for property rights, more demand for a legal framework, and then they can hold the government accountable. So that's how I see the linkage between the market-based solutions. And again, don't call me crazy, but the fact of the matter is that that's the way the rest of the world works.
At the back there, you'll have to speak loudly, please.
Okay, so on the first question, there's somebody, this is quite a while ago, I think it was in New York, someone said to me, after I'd done a speech, said, you know what, let me say, because basically what you're describing is something that we all experience, which is kind of like having a teenager lying on your couch. And sorry for the teenagers in the room. But they lie on the couch with a remote control, maybe they have a beer in their hand, and every day you say to them, please go get a job, or please go to school, please clean up your room, and they don't. And the following month, you have the same conversation, and they don't again. And so the question then becomes, how do you get this person to be incentivized to do the right thing? And it is, excuse my French, bloody tough. And basically, you need tough love. which is why the prescription is they have to be cut off. They need to understand that slowly but surely, and I'm not saying turn off the taps tomorrow, I'm saying wean them off slowly, saying this year you had $100 of aid, $5 of trade, or let's call it, sorry, make it easier, $95 of aid, $3 of trade, $2 of remittances. Next year, you're going to have $90 of aid. You better raise the rest of it through trade or through some other remittances. Slowly come up with an agenda to wean them off so that they understand they have to get off the couch. The problem in Africa right now is that I cannot tell you how irritating I find it when I attend meetings and I see African governments skulking around, trying to get more attention to get more aid money, when there are very basic things they could be doing, as I outlined for you already, in terms of trade, regional integration, creating investment climates, that over time would make this region the amazing region that it should be, instead of continuing to pursue the aid system that we're pursuing. So that's what I would say to that. Your other question, I'm sorry, I'd written it down. But oh, yes. Actually, yes, but I'm not a politician. Sometimes I give closed-door advice. My little dirty secret is that I was asked to go to Libya, and I did go, by Colonel Gaddafi. Don't stone me yet. But he asked me to go. He's the head of the African Union. That is a whole other conversation. I'll have to come back to Waterloo for that one. But he was elected by I have no idea what they were thinking, but they elected him. And he got my book and wanted me to go and address the African heads of state. So I went to Libya. I did not meet with him. It's another whole conversation. I'm going back to see him because I would like to have a conversation, closed door, so I can really lay it in thick to the African leaders. And then I have had meetings with individual presidents and policymakers. Some of them are very open. It's hard work. What I'm proposing is hard work. It's very easy, I think, to pick up the phone and say, oh, CEDA, please, can you give us another $1 billion? We're desperate. Our people are going to die. Okay, here's another check. But to go and do what I'm prescribing, talking to thousands of pension funds and hedge fund managers to try and convince them to invest in your country is hard work. And a lot of people don't want to do the hard work.
We'll give the last question to an undergraduate. How's that?
Okay.
My name is Nathaniel Askin, and I'm an Indes student here, or International Development Department for the academic. I have an economics question. The worsening of inequality that just comes along with industrialization historically.
It's a very good question. It's a very tough question as well, because I think one of the problems that we are grappling with is not just inequality between the richest nations and the poorest nations, but even within country income inequality. I think the obvious answer, which most people would say, is redistribution. So you increase the taxes on people who where the wealth is pooling and redistribute it to lower income people. I think one of the most innovative things that's going on right now in the aid system, which I think could be replicated, in fact I know there's a pilot program that Michael Bloomberg, the mayor of New York, is trying out in New York right now, are what they call conditional aid transfers. Obviously in New York it's not an aid transfer, but it's the same concept. And the idea there is you pay people to do the right thing. So for example, your child goes to school, you pay them, they pay the mother $20. The child gets immunized, you pay the mother $10. It's done very, very well in places like Mexico and Brazil. As I said, Michael Bloomberg is doing exactly a pilot program using private money to try and incentivize people, lower income people, to do the right thing and to get a job. So if you have 5 job applications and you have 3 job interviews, you get paid $50, for example. So I'm not saying that's perfect. I'm just saying that that's the kind of innovation we need to think about. I don't necessarily like redistribution in its pure form. Otherwise, I would be a big supporter of aid. But I think that there are ways to make it so that people don't end up with an open-ended dependency culture that we have in Africa today. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'd just like to ask John Tennant to come forward. He's standing beside me now. He's just a recent recipient in this area of the Cambridge Chamber of Commerce Lifetime Achievement Award. He's an excellent individual at attracting business to this area. But before that, he had quite a distinguished career in the Foreign Service, most recently as Canadian Consul General in Detroit during the period of time when 9/11 occurred, and was very involved in border issues there. But earlier, Director General for Asia Pacific in Foreign Affairs and International Trade, and with assignments in Chicago, New York, Tokyo, West Africa, and Central America, the Caribbean, and Australia. And he is now the Special Advisor for the Africa Initiative of the Center for International Governance Innovation. So, John, would you come forward, and thank you for being here to thank our speaker.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here tonight on behalf of CG as a partner in this event, to extend very, very special thanks on behalf of all of you to Dr. Moyo for what we have enjoyed this evening. I think you've seen, Dr. Moyo, that people have come with a great interest and plenty of ideas on this topic. Larry gave us all some more reasons as Canadians and as people in this community to be interested in this topic. You have delivered, I think, something that everybody would agree is incredibly articulate, eloquent, very direct. You have great ambition in terms of the ideas that you've presented, and of course have made some very direct calls to action. So we have the opportunity to leave here with even more to think about. In the case of CG, it's very timely because CG is engaged with partners, Salama Shield Foundation and Makerere University in Uganda in an African initiative on climate change. So this is something that fits very well with some of the things that are going on there. And I know everybody here has said this is a Friday night that was very, very well spent. Thank you for being here and for all you've done.
Well, it remains for me to conclude this evening's activities and to invite you to the vestibule behind to purchase a copy of Dr. Moyo's book, and she will sign it for you. Before we do that, I'd like to thank our partners, the Balsley School of International Affairs and CG, for helping sponsor the event. But lastly, but not leastly, and perhaps most importantly, these events never get organized on their own. They take a lot of detail and a lot of work. And I'd like to thank personally the two key staff members who put this on tonight from St. Paul's University College, Grania Ryder and Kelly Deeks. Where are they? There's Grania. There's Kelly. A round of applause for them. Thank you. Good night. Stay tuned. We'll let you know about the Kerr Saltzman 2010 lecture and hope to have you back at some point. Thank you for being here. Good night.